Many scholars agree that Revelation is a parallel to the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is called the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus prophesied the judgment to come upon Israel for their rejection of the Messiah. It was this judgment that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. Luke and Mark also record the Olivet Discourse in their Gospels, but the Gospel of John does not. Many have wondered about this absence from the fourth Gospel of the Olivet Discourse that occupies such a conspicuous place in each of the other three Gospels. But in Revelation we get John's version of the Olivet Discourse, which he expands to parallel the symbolism of Ezekiel. Revelation is written 5 or so years before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, and reminds Jewish believers of the judgment that is to come upon those who pierced him. John writes here in Revelation with incredible urgency about what was soon to overtake the church. The judgment that was to come upon the Jews, to come upon apostate Israel that had been prophesied by Jesus about in Matthew 24. If you're not familiar with that word apostate, it simply means one who looks like they are preaching the gospel, but they are not. So apostate Israel refers to unbelieving Israel. So the Apostle John is writing in Revelation about the judgment that is soon to come upon unbelieving Israel. It's almost time, he says, the old, the obsolete, the age of Moses, the old covenant age was about to be done away with for good. In Revelation, John was writing a prophetic drama before the events of AD 70, warning Christians of the destruction that was about to come upon Jerusalem, and speaking to the churches during a time of intense persecution, when the early believers needed all the encouragement that they could get. He was showing them what was happening in the kingdom of God and what would soon happen to relieve their suffering. Dr. Jonathan Welton says, from AD 30 to 70, the church suffered terrible persecution at the hands of the Jewish temple leaders. This greatly intensified in AD 64 to 68 under Nero, who made it his goal to completely annihilate Christianity. During this very difficult time, the church needed encouragement from Jesus. They needed reassurance that he would be coming back soon, and this is just what Revelation gave them. Throughout Revelation, God is telling his followers to be patient, because his justice, wrath, and vengeance are coming very soon. He goes on to say the early believers would have already had the writings of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and Revelation was a timely reminder of what Jesus had prophesied 35 years earlier, and would serve to encourage them in the face of persecution. God was ruling from heaven, and he will subdue all their enemies. David Chilton notes that the purpose of Revelation was to reveal Christ as Lord to a suffering church. The persecuted Christians were not forsaken by God. In reality, they were on the front lines of the conflict of the ages, a conflict in which Jesus Christ had already won the decisive battle. The greatest enemy of the early church was apostate Israel, which used the power of the Roman Empire to try to stamp out Christianity, just as it had used Rome in the crucifixion of the Lord himself. This then is a major thread of the story of Revelation, Christ's vindication of his people who are suffering for their testimony of faith in him. John emphasizes this in his introduction to Revelation. He's writing Revelation to strengthen the Christian community in their faith in Jesus' lordship. These threads, the speaking of judgment that was to come upon unbelieving Israel and the encouragement to suffering Christians, are knitted together and lead to the fullness of God's redemptive plan, the revealing of Jesus. The reality is that as long as the temple stood in Jerusalem, which it did till AD 70, the Old Covenant continued to operate in opposition to the New Covenant and continued to veil God's heart and hinder his intent to see the gospel spread to all mankind.